Welcome to the mystery of life.
Human trafficking is the fastest growing activity of criminal groups and is the third largest crime industry in the world, behind drug dealing and arms trafficking. Human trafficking is the trade of humans for the purpose of forced labor, sexual slavery, or commercial sexual exploitation. This includes providing a spouse for forced marriages, or removing and selling organs or tissues. Human trafficking violates the victim's rights through coercion. It is the trade in people as a commodity, especially of women and children. Human trafficking is related to people smuggling, human smuggling or migrant smuggling. They go by different names, but the difference is if the person being trafficked or smuggled is going against their will. Many times, smuggling can turn into human trafficking through coercion and exploitation. Trafficked people are held against their will by being threatened and forced to work for or provide services to the trafficker or others. The arrangement may be structured as a work contract, but with low payment, or sometimes with no payment at all, or on terms which are highly exploitative. Sometimes the arrangement is more like a debt bondage, where the victim is not permitted or able to pay off the debt at all. According to the International Labor Organization, forced labor alone generates an estimated $150 billion in profits per year. In 2012, it is estimated that 21 million victims are trapped in modern-day slavery. 68% were exploited for labor, 22% were sexually exploited, and 10% were enslaved by the government. Child workers, minorities, and migrants are more at risk of extreme forms of exploitation. Over half of the world's 215 million young workers are involved in forced sex work and forced street begging. Others work dangerous environments such as leather tanning, mining, and stone quarry work. Bonded labor, or debt bondage, is probably the least known form of labor trafficking today. But it is the most common way to enslave people. Victims become bonded when the value of their services is not applied toward the repayment of the debt. Forced labor is when people are forced to work against their will under the threat of violence or some other form of punishment. Their freedom is limited and a degree of ownership is used or at least implied, meaning the victim is owned by another person. What are some causes for so many people being trafficked? Both men and women can be trafficked for unskilled work, which can include domestic servitude, which is basically slavery, work on farms, sweatshops, factories, janitorial, food service, and other service industries, including begging. Examples of products that can be made by forced labor are clothing, cocoa, bricks, coffee, cotton, and gold. Poverty, lack of education, with no hope for the future may lead women to voluntarily migrate out of their hometown and be involuntarily trafficked into sex work. Long waiting lists for organs in the United States and Europe created an international black market for organs. Traffickers harvest organs, especially kidneys, to sell for large profit, often without paying the victims or taking care of them afterwards. Victims are often from poor, rural communities. They don't have many options other than to sell their organs. Wealthy countries that can't meet their own organ demands fuel the practice of organ harvesting. The internet plays a big role in human trafficking, to a large extent, making it easier. Online classified sites and social networks are used by clients and traffickers. Traffickers use websites to market, recruit, sell, and exploit women. Pimps use the internet to recruit minors since there are more and more kids using the internet and social networking sites every day. Some people argue that because sex work, prostitution, is illegal, it creates demand for underground market for sex work and enables sex trafficking. Many women entering into the sex trafficking industry are minors whom have already experienced prior sexual abuse. Traffickers take advantage of young girls by luring them into the business through force, threat, and coercion, but more often through false promises of love, security, and protection. This form of coercion works by leading the victim into the life of a sex worker, while also reinforcing a trauma bond, also known as Stockholm Syndrome. Stockholm Syndrome is a psychological response where the victim becomes attached to their perpetrator. The goal of a trafficker is to turn a human being into a slave. To do this, abusers use tactics that lead victims to believe they no longer have any control over their lives. Among these tactics, traffickers can hold their victims captive, expose them to large amounts of alcohol, drugs, keep them in isolation, or withhold food or sleep. During this time, the victim is experiencing sleep disturbances and is under extreme stress, often begins to feel the onset of depression, guilt and self-blame, anger and rage, numbing and PTSD. Under these pressures, the victim can fall into the hopeless mental state known as learned helplessness. Simply, the victim is broken. The abuser picks up the pieces. For victims of forced prostitution and sexual slavery, it usually begins by violence. Traffickers employ practices of sexual abuse, torture, brainwashing, repeated rape and physical assault until the victim submits to their fate as a sexual slave. Victims experience verbal threats, social isolation, and intimidation before they accept their role as a prostitute. It's the same playbook. Break the victim and pick up the pieces. Victims of sex trafficking often get branded by their traffickers or pimps. They are usually tattooed with barcodes, or the trafficker's name or rules. Even if a victim escapes or gets rescued, these tattoos are painful reminders of their past. Removing or covering their tattoos can still cause emotional distress and trauma. For those enslaved for forced labor, the trauma often comes from living as a slave. Victims are captives and are used for financial gain of their owners. The abusers add additional trauma by cutting victims off from all forms of social connection. Isolation allows the perpetrator to destroy the victim's sense of self and increase their dependence on the perpetrator. Human trafficking victims may experience complex trauma that include depression, anxiety, self-hatred, dissociation, substance abuse, self-destructive behaviors, medical and somatic concerns, despair, and re-victimization. Psychology researchers report that, although similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, complex trauma is more expansive in diagnosis because the victims may have been abused for many years of their lives. Children are especially vulnerable because of their age. In order to gain complete control of the child, traffickers often destroy the physical and mental health of the children through constant physical and emotional abuse. Victims experience severe trauma on a daily basis that completely destroys the healthy development of self-concept, self-worth, biological integrity, and cognitive functioning. Children who grow up in environments of constant exploitation frequently exhibit antisocial behavior, over-sexualized behavior, self-harm, aggression, distrust of adults, dissociative disorders, substance abuse, complex trauma, and attention deficit disorders. Stockholm Syndrome is also a common problem for trafficked girls, which can actually prevent them from both trying to escape and getting help from recovery programs. Although 98% of the sex trade is composed of women and girls, there are impacts of abuse common in sex trafficking upon young boys. Boys often will experience forms of post-traumatic stress disorder, social stigma of homosexuality associated with sexual abuse for boys, and externalization of blame, increased anger, and desire for revenge. Children are sought by customers because they are perceived as being less likely to be HIV positive. As of 2018, profits from human trafficking were about around $150 billion each year. Along with drug trafficking, human trafficking is one of the most profitable transnational crimes. Sex trafficking is more profitable than non-sex trafficking. $99 billion of $150 billion is from commercial sexual exploitation. Although only 19% of victims are trafficked for sexual exploitation, it makes up 66% of the global earnings of human trafficking. The average annual profits generated by each woman in forced sexual servitude is $100,000. It is estimated to be 6 times more than the average profits generated by each trafficking victim worldwide, which is $21,800. The low-risk, high-reward nature of human trafficking has created a breeding ground for it to thrive. The traffickers generate huge profits yet face minimal consequences. Human trafficking is one of the most profitable illegal industries that is second to the drug trade. While drugs are consumables, human beings can be sold repeatedly. There are many efforts globally to fight against human trafficking, but is it enough? Human trafficking is considered a violation of human rights by international conventions. According to the U.S. State Department, Belarus, Iran, Russia, and Turkmenistan remain among the worst countries to providing protection against human trafficking and forced labor. What is the rest of the world doing about this? The UN's Trafficking Protocol is the first global, legally binding instrument on trafficking. One of its purposes is to have countries around the world work together in investigating and prosecuting such trafficking. Another goal is to protect and help victims based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The UN's Trafficking Protocol, which had 117 signatories and as of November 2018 defines human trafficking as, paraphrasing, the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring or receipt of persons, by means of threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power or of a position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person, for the purpose of exploitation. Exploitation shall include, at a minimum, the exploitation or the prostitution of others or other forms of sexual exploitation, forced labor or services, slavery or practices similar to slavery, servitude or the removal, manipulation or implantation of organs. In 2014, for the first time in history, major leaders of many religions, Buddhist, Anglican, Catholic, and Orthodox Christian, Hindu, Jewish, and Muslim, met to sign a shared commitment against modern-day slavery. The declaration they signed calls for the elimination of slavery and human trafficking by 2020. That was over 2 years ago. Today, there are still over 24 million people being trafficked.